Chipping and rust effects on a winter tank? Well, I mean, sure, why not, right? Is it a bad idea? No, absolutely not. Can it get out of hand? Definitely yes, and this video will show you how to keep it restricted and ensure your nice winter whitewash will remain clean and white. And we are also gonna paint all the tiny details, and you'll see me painting a piece of stowage for the first time. So get yourself a snack or a drink and let's get the show on the road. What's up, mates? Guess who? Last week we enhanced our winter camouflage with enamel washes and some ambient occlusion, which means the model is ready for the next big step. I gotta say that I was a little hesitant about chipping this model because it looks pretty interesting as it is. But then I realized no model I make is finished unless it has some chipping and rust. However, let's keep in mind that some of those chips are supposed to be covered with whitewash, so we'll be focusing only on the green parts, aka the engine deck, fenders, roof, glazes and back plate. And I'm also gonna paint fake panel lines on these toolboxes and all the details as well. We're gonna start with the time-saving sponge method for the first layer of light-colored superficial chips. My favorite 4BO chipping color is Russian Highlight from Ammo's modulation set. Sponge application is much easier when the paint is a little thicker, so we're gonna use the paint as it is, straight from the bottle. And as always, it's important to remove most of the paint on a piece of paper until it leaves just a few random dots here and there. I found it best to start working in places which are not gonna be very visible. Here you can get familiar with the paint properties and you'll be more confident when working on the upper portions of your model. This never happens to me when I paint the chips with a paintbrush. However, a sponge can be a bit unpredictable at times. At least that's my experience. One thing you might notice is that the contrast between the light green chipping color and the distressed base coat isn't very obvious. This might be a good thing, because if you make a mistake, it won't be too evident. Or a bad thing, because you might feel like all this work isn't producing any results whatsoever. I felt both ways, but then I realized the truth might be somewhere in the middle. Yes, the light green chipping might not be overly obvious, but it will definitely help the dark gray steel chips stand out. But more on that later. With the sponge chipping done, let's take the same paint, add 2 drops of drying retarder, and mix them together. The paint won't be drying up on your brush all the time, which will make the painting process much easier and more pleasant. And speaking of brushes, I'm gonna use my favorite 000 from Vallejo. This step is all about refining the sponge applied chipping. Refining and expanding the effect further, because here's the thing. Sponge applied chips are cool and all of that, but for me, they don't really cut it. They work great as a foundation and a roadmap for additional chipping work. And it's in fact very easy to follow them with your paintbrush and add some extra fine chips here and there. Or you can connect some random flakes into bigger sections. Also, sponge is not very good at getting into tighter places and corners, so a good paintbrush is your only bet here. If I was working with a regular acrylic paint without those 2 drops of drying retarder, the paint would be drying up on me all the time. This would make me clean the brush every few seconds, and the whole process would be quite frustrating. With the addition of retarder, you can paint for as long as there's some paint on your brush. One more thing worth keeping in mind is that you should focus your chipping around exposed places that see a lot of traffic, aka people walking around or stuff hitting the tank. And this is another thing where the entire painting process starts to click together. Because we already marked those high traffic parts of the tank with winter camo, or to be more precise, with the lack of winter camo. This is just one example where all the decisions you make throughout the painting process will start connecting at some point. And I'm sure we'll see more of that in the upcoming videos. Okay, so the light layer of chipping is done, and like I said, it might not be overly evident in some places, but it's quite necessary as it will make the second layer of dark colored steel chips more evident and 3-dimensional. They will be painted with a medium gray mixed from these two. I always do a little bit of experimenting before I find the ratio that works best for each model, and in this case it was 4 parts dark gray and 2 drops of light gray. Feel free to experiment on your own. The same paint could be mixed using pure black and white. I'm just using the paints I have. After all, mixing a gray paint is not rocket science. And using the same 000 brush as before, we can start filling in the light chips. As you noticed, I also added 2 drops of paint drying retarder and 1 drop of tap water, so that the paint has a consistency of milk and it won't dry overly fast. Here you might need to do some more experimenting as well, because as I found out, not all paint retarders are the same, and some are actually pretty thick. The one from AK Interactive that I'm using is just slightly thicker than tap water, so I'm also using it as a thinner, basically. That's why I need to add just 1 drop of water. And if you're thinking what's that primer red fuel cap, well, that is a kit feature, and to me it looks like an exposed fuel cap without its armored cover, so I painted it in primer red. Don't worry, it'll get toned down in the end. Filling in the light colored chips is easier and harder at the same time. It's easier because you don't have to think about their placement, you're just filling in the previous layer. But then it's also more difficult because you have to be more careful and patient because, surprisingly, filling small chips with even smaller chips is not as easy as it sounds. The most important thing about this step is to fill the light chips partially, making sure the result is a dark gray steel chip surrounded by a thin outline of light paint. This step is also more time consuming, but I don't know, it's still pretty fun. Let's now address those stowage boxes. If you've been watching this series, then you know that I wasn't able to add the missing line separating the box from its lid, because the boxes were firmly glued in place. At first I was like, I'll just leave it as it is, but then I realized that you can get away with painting fake details in smaller scales. So first I had to find a good piece of something that's thin and straight, and this copper sheet offcut is just perfect for the task. This will be my guide for painting somewhat straight lines. I'm not using the chipping color for any particular reason, but it's dark enough, so why not? Any imperfections in the straight lines can be blamed on the sheet metal lid getting deformed by regular use. Being able to find a good excuse for your mistakes is the most important modeling skill. And then I added a few chips around the entire box lid to make the fake effect look more natural, and then I used the same enamel paint which I used in the previous video to make a wash. Regular wash is about adding diluted paint around details and letting the capillary action do the work for you. Here I had to use the thicker paint from the inside of the bottle cap and carefully brush it on top of the fake panel lines. And then I cleaned the excess wash with small amount of enamel thinner, just like one would do with regular washes. The only difference is that I had to be careful not to remove too much paint, exposing the dark gray line underneath. The result is, well, not excellent, but dare I say pretty effective. It will change a little with the upcoming weathering steps, but overall, it's not so bad. So let's now quickly finish the chipping on the turret, which was super easy because I only had to chip the roof and the gun barrel and proceed to the next step, rust tones. I had to be super careful with this step because too much rust would affect the winter whitewash in a bad way. So I had to make sure the rust will only be where it has to be, aka around the dark steel chips. For this reason I found a pretty small 00 cheap brush which seems perfect for this job, and I think I'll keep using it on my future models as well, both large and small scales. The method is as straightforward as you would imagine. First you have to apply the enamel rust tone over the steel chipping, and then using the same small brush and some enamel thinner, you gently feather the edges of the rust spots. If you're not sure about the final result, then it's best to start on parts made from sheet metal, which corrodes much faster than armor plates. If you end up with too much rust, you can still pull it off as sheet metal getting more rusty. If you feel like the amount is just right, you can happily continue on the armored sections as well. Now, I know how controversial this technique is, but it's hard to deny how it makes your plastic model look more metal and heavier. And also the sheer amount of fine surface detail it creates is just... I don't know, but I think it looks really cool. That's obviously why I keep doing it on all my models. It also helps to tell a story behind the model, as any tank that's beaten up communicates to the viewer that it's been through some stuff. That's probably as much as I can tell about this technique, so let's move on. Paint all the surface details and get this model ready for some earth effects. These periscopes are really simplified, and all we have here are their armored covers molded as a solid piece. It's quite easy to make them work the way they are. Just paint a rectangular shape with relatively straight edges, and I'm saying relatively because I know how hard it is to paint such a tiny piece. But yeah, try to make it as straight as possible and you get a nice base for the clear part of the periscope. You can in fact use the same color for the machine guns as well, just keep in mind that this is just a base color and further effects will make these details look very different. And in case you were wondering, both of those were painted with this paint. Now take a slightly lighter color and paint the lower half of the periscope. This will add some depth and make the periscope look three-dimensional, as if you could see behind the glass. And I used this mixture to also paint the rubber parts of the wheels. Keep in mind that KV tanks had all their wheels made from steel and only the return rollers were cladded with rubber. The color I used for this step was basically the same as the chipping, and I mixed it from the same paints. The final step is to cover the periscopes with a few layers of enamel gloss. This will make them look like actual glass. Glossy glass. You can technically use acrylic gloss as well, but make sure it's not lacquer based like Tamiya because it would dissolve the paint underneath. I used AK's Wet Effects fluid, which is essentially an enamel gloss varnish. Let's now tackle the exhausts. I decided to base coat them with Life Color's Incinerated White, which is a super matte white paint with a hint of red. Then I mixed a dark rusty color from these two and painted lots of small rusty flakes over each exhaust pipe. This will add some texture to them and yeah, it probably looks quite weird, but most of you OGs probably know where this is headed because this is my usual method. But before we get to the final magic trick, I also decided to add some of this Russian light base here and there to simulate some remaining paint still holding on the exhausts. Let's now take the enamel rust effect and tie it all together. Give it a few moments to dry up, and boom! That's a pretty radical change, isn't it? Exhausts should always have different texture and color than the remaining rust effects on your model, because they corrode from heat. The only thing that remains is the smoke residue, but we'll add it once the model is finished. Let's now paint the tarp. To be completely honest here, I don't know what happened, but first thing first. As you probably figured, I decided to paint the tarp in dark gray. I used a mixture of these paints for that, and now the real problem began when I noticed the paint drying into a satin finish. I wish I filmed the whole thing, but I was quite panicked, and in some moments I started thinking about covering the tarp with another tarp, because it got worse. So I decided to give it another layer of the same paint, but then it dried into a glossy finish. So, obviously panicked, I gave it another layer, and the same result. I honestly have no idea why this happened. I mean, all Vallejo paints dry into a matte finish, if they're not specifically made to be glossy. And yeah, I was just losing my mind and forgot to film the whole fiasco. Desperate situations call for desperate measures, and I decided to mix the dark gray paint with Tamiya flat base in 50-50 ratio and repainted the whole thing, and luckily it worked. The huge amount of flat base made the paint lighter, which is great because that was my original intention. Funny thing is that I bought this Tamiya bottle for this specific reason, and I don't know why I didn't use it in the first layer. Anyway, it worked, so let's add some shadows and highlights. I think it's no surprise that I'm very bad at this, because I usually avoid stowage and tarps, and as such don't have much practice, but with the limited experience I have, I find shading with oil paints much easier than with acrylics, which is the more usual method. And also the reason why I usually paint tarps in grayish colors is because it makes shading super easy. You just need to use black and light gray. So the method is pretty obvious. First you have to brush some black oil paint into all those crevices. Although I found out the ultra matte base coat makes it harder to blend the paint. So it's best to work one crevice at a time and not the way you see on your screen. And then carefully blend it with the combination of completely dry brush and some enamel thinner until you're happy with the result, which is gonna look something like this. Or no, hopefully better than this. The point is, the tarp starts to look a lot more interesting. The same goes for highlights. You just have to place them on all of those raised faults and repeat the blending process. If you remember the construction video, I said how it's important to sculpt as many faults as you can, as they'll make the tarp more interesting, but more importantly easier to paint, and here you can see clearly why. And I gotta say that I was actually having a pretty good time at this point, so maybe I should start adding some stowage to my future models because it's a nice addition to the overall heavy metal appearance of the tank. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and hey, this is actually the last detail, so that's it for tonight. So now we have this model ready for the actual weathering, aka dust, mud, grime and all those other things. And the first thing we're gonna tackle are the tracks, because I want to make a separate video about them. Painting tracks which are attached to a model is not as hard as it seems, but what makes those more challenging are the large gaps and overall poor fit of some of the links, which I'm gonna try to hide under the mud. So let's see how it goes, or actually how it went, because my patrons already know, and they have access to lots of detailed photos, extra tips and thoughts about painting and weathering. So if that's something you'd like yourself, consider checking out and joining my Patreon gang. That's all I wanted to say, so I hope you'll have a great weekend, and if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like and leave a comment because it helps me a lot. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet and want to see more, then do it right now so you won't miss the upcoming videos, which I keep posting like all the time, right? Thank you all for watching, I'll see you mates in the next one, and here are some bloopers. These periscopes are really simplified. These periscopes are really simplified. Now take a slightly lighter color and paint the lower half. Keep in mind that KV tanks, kaiju tanks. Yeah, KV tanks are actually quite kaiju. Tamiya the huge amount of flat for that. The huge amount of It's no surprise that I'm very bad at this, because I usually avoid stowage and tarps, and as such don't have much practice. Kicho tam!